Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee of 2021. Apologies have been received from committee members Andy Whiteman and Alex Rowley. Item 1 is a decision by the committee to take item 3 in private. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed, thank you. We now turn to item number 2 on the agenda, which is our public procurement inquiry, and I would introduce at this point Ivan McKee, Minister for Trade, Innovation and Public Finance, supported by his official Susan Craig, who is the Procurement Policy Manager at Procurement and Property for the Scottish Government. So I would now invite the Minister to make a brief opening statement, and thereafter we'll come to questions from committee members. So, Minister, over to you.
Good morning, Convener. Good morning, Committee. And I'd like to start by saying how pleased I am to be here in my first appearance at this committee since adding procurement to my portfolio responsibilities. And as Minister for Trade, Innovation and Public Finance, I welcome the opportunity to focus on how procurement is and can continue to be a key enabler of government's wider priorities. And very relevant to that is the focus today of the committee's scrutiny of the Procurement Reform Scotland Act 2014. We welcome the committee's interest in this area and for all the stakeholders for their inputs to this process. Over many years we have taken significant steps to shape public procurement in Scotland, starting in 2006 with the publication of the McClelland Report on public procurement in Scotland, in which a number of critical success factors were identified to get the best value from public procurement in Scotland. In 2016, we published a report that reflected on the overall progress of the public procurement reform programme from 2006 to 2016. And 2016 was also the year when most of the provisions of the Procurement Reform Scotland Act 2014 came into force. The Act enshrined in law the principles of public procurement in Scotland, introduced the sustainable procurement duty, using procurement processes to increase social, economic and environmental well-being, made it easier for small businesses to access and to compete for public sector contracts, and increased the transparency of public bodies' procurement activities. Almost 5 years on, we're embarking on a process of reviewing the effectiveness of our policies. In December, we published the findings of research we commissioned into the impact and value of the sustainable procurement duty. We have recently undertaken a survey of suppliers to the public sector, asking about their experiences of bidding for public contracts, and are currently analysing the 1,500 responses received. We hope to publish those findings in the coming weeks. We will soon be publishing the second annual Scottish Ministers' Report on procurement activity in Scotland, which will provide an overview of public procurement activity in 2018-19. This report is informed by individual annual procurement reports that more than 100 public bodies are obliged to publish under the 2014 Reform Act. Looking at the first of the reports I've mentioned, the Sustainable Procurement Duty report, it found that the duty has led to a step change in procurement practice. There has been significant progress since the duty was introduced in Scotland, is ahead of many other countries in its approach to sustainable procurement practices. The report reveals evidence that the duty is contributing to the achievement of national outcomes and the Scottish Government's overarching purpose. However, although significant progress has been made, it recognises that more remains to be done across all strands of the duty to take implementation to the next level. We are not complacent. It is through all of these reports that we will better understand what has gone well and where there is more we can do. And in that vein, we very much welcome this committee's work to scrutinise the Reform Act and the opportunity to give evidence today. We view it as an important element of our own review. The Act is recognised in other parts of the UK as progressive and enabling, with the Welsh Government replicating much of its provisions in its social partnership legislation, and the UK Government picking up much of what we have had as established legislation since coming into effect in 2016 in its current Green Paper consultation for reform. I welcome this opportunity today to provide evidence to the committee on progress to date and our plans to continue to do more to ensure that public money invested in contracts with suppliers impacts on Scotland's economy and communities. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. We now come to questions from Richard Lyle. Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. We all know that public procurement has a tremendous impact to stimulate the economy. So can I ask, how is the Scottish Government seeking to promote economic recovery from the COVID crisis through public procurement, and do you foresee any particular obstacles in your way?
It really has a significant beneficial impact to play, and it's important we harness that power, that spend of more than £12 billion across central government, Scottish Government, local authorities, the NHS, universities, colleges and others. And Richard Lyle will be aware from the work that we've published that we see the sustainable procurement duty as being a key part of that. So making sure that within the rules that exist, as much of that spend as possible can be directed to Scottish businesses, in particular to Scottish SMEs, where we have made significant progress over the past years, making the barriers, reducing the barriers for those businesses to be able to access those procurement opportunities, and a number of steps have been taken in that regard too, and also focusing very much on community wealth building, which is a key focus of the Scottish Government, and looking for opportunities where we can really embed and increase the impact of community wealth building. And we've taken forward actually 5 pilot projects across different parts of Scotland to work closely with local authorities and others to embed community wealth building to maximise the impact of that procurement spend within local communities.
Can I ask, has the Scottish Government given any consideration to developing standardised measures of procurement outcomes to assist in measuring the impact of sustainable procurement duty?
Well, there are a number of standard measures that are in place, and if you look through the report that we publish on an annual basis, there are several measures in there, looking at the type of spend, looking at the type of suppliers that benefit from that spend and where they're located, looking at where that spend is coming from, and the sectors it's being spent in, looking at, with regards to community wealth building, the different benefits that we see there, be that round about training, skills development and other aspects of economic benefit to the local community. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the summary report we pulled together is a summation of individual reports from more than 100 different public bodies, local authorities, health boards and many others. And we pulled together the analysis that they have of their local spend priorities. So clearly there's some scope within that for individual boards to present data as they see fit, but there is a template, and as I say, much of that data is rolled up to a national level for us to be able to understand better the overall picture and impact.
And a small follow-up, Convener. Minister, some small companies feel they can't access tender lists. How do we help small companies to get on, in particular, say, council tender lists?
Always very keen to do that, and significant steps have been taken through the Public Contract Scotland and the quick quotes process that's in there to help to make that process easier, and through the supplier development programme, where many businesses, I think more than 1,000 extra businesses just in the last year came on board in that programme. So many businesses, small businesses, are involved in that programme, where we've got advice and training and support to enable them to access those contracts. But if you actually look at the success factors of 58%, if you look at the Scottish spend last year, 58% of spend was with Scottish SMEs. If you look at the spend within Scotland last year, on Scottish businesses, 58% of that was with SMEs, and they account for only 40% of business turnover in Scotland. So in that sense, I think SMEs are able to take advantage of those significant benefits that exist from engaging with public sector procurement in Scotland.
That's good to hear. Thank you, Convener. That's me.
Thank you, Mr. Lyle. Minister, just a few questions from myself. What is the Scottish Government doing in terms of the wider supply chain? So if we think in terms of requirements of fair work and so forth. How can the measures you've talked about take account of the wider supply chain rather than just the primary supplier who's awarded the contract?
Yeah, it's a great question. In terms of ensuring that, let's take an example, prompt payments, an issue that I know that that is of concern, and clearly, well, we've got a very, very good record at Scottish Government level with more than 99% of invoices paid within 10 days. Clearly, what's important is that that rolls through to tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, so they can also benefit from that. So initiatives such as project bank accounts, which means that we can pay subcontractors at the same time as we are paying the primary contractor, really helps to move that forward. I think that's made a significant difference, and we continue to roll that out and looking at other opportunities where we can do that. So working with the primary contractors to get them to report on their performance with regards to prompt payment further down their supply is another initiative where we're taking steps to ensure that these benefits roll down, as you say, through the rest of the supply chain. But it's not just the primary contractors that benefit from them.
Well, Minister, that talks about prompt payment. I was actually asking about fair work. So what's being done to ensure that those who are not the primary supplier adhere to conditions in contracts, or what can be done to do that in terms
Well, of course, you've got to remember that because we don't have control over employment law in Scotland, there's a limit to what we can do with regard to putting these requirements into contracts. And clearly, having employment law is something we've argued for that would allow us, for example, to put the real living wage and other aspects of fair work first into those contracts. But if you look at what we are doing to help to roll that down through, clearly we've got the procurement policy notes that are in place that identify what the best practice guidelines are for fair work implementation. We work closely with tier 1 suppliers to understand what their practices are with regards to engaging with tier 2 and tier 3 subcontractors. And if you look at some of the criteria, the projects where we've applied that criteria, there's been several projects where we've worked with those suppliers to embed the Fair Work First criteria as far down the supply chain as we can. But clearly, of course, the primary contractor will engage with who they see fit to be able to support the work that they're undertaking. And as I said, because we don't have control over employment law, there's a limit to how much enforceability we can put round about those criteria.
Minister, I'm just wondering, in terms of, I suppose, knowledge of what is going on, procurement reports, is there things the Scottish Government can do in that regard so that we know what's going on? And at the same time, of course, we appreciate that some of these things may, it's a fine balance between getting the information and not actually slowing things down or preventing things happening by overburdening companies with regulation and so forth. Do you have any comments on that?
No, you're absolutely right. We need to get that balance correct because it's at the end of the day, whatever data we pull together, whatever requirements we put in place, then it's businesses that have to provide that information and analysis, and then it's local authorities and health boards and others that need to put in place the processes to collect and monitor that data. So it is about getting that balance. I think we've got that balance correct because at the end of the day, we talked about small businesses, SMEs, and clearly the more reporting requirements you put in place, and particularly the harder it becomes for them to do that. So I think collecting that data is important, and I think we've got that right in terms of as I mentioned, the policy note we put out there, the best practice guidelines. The fact that, going back to your previous question, we do expect primary contractors to apply Fair Work First right down through their supply chain, and as part of that bidding process, primary suppliers are asked to commit to fair work principles for their whole supply chain. So at that level, we're asking for that commitment, and we'll collect the data back from those from those primary suppliers to allow us to be able to monitor that. But as you rightly say, getting that balance right between not making the process too cumbersome and therefore potentially excluding, in particular, SMEs from the process.
Thank you, Minister. We now come to questions from Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, I suppose from the time that I was first elected, I've had a whole stream of complaints about the procurement process and how it disadvantages small companies and so forth. Now, just touching on what the convener was talking about, the committee has received evidence from local authorities and from industry bodies about the lack of resources for monitoring progress against agreed outcomes in procurement contracts. Do you think there are enough resources and systems in place to carry out this monitoring and evaluation?
SMEs, so businesses under 250 employees, they represent about 40% of business turnover in Scotland, but they benefit from, in total, 47% of public sector procurement contracts, and that rises to 58% when you consider just the Scottish businesses only. So I think clearly there are many SMEs that would love to get more public sector contracts, and of course, if you've got a business, absolutely that's what you want to do. You will want to push and get as much of that business as you possibly can, of course. But I think in terms of the steps we've taken, I've outlined to make that process as supported and as friendly as possible for smaller businesses to access. The fact that those numbers talk to small businesses getting more than their turnover share in actuality of those contracts. But in terms of the monitoring and evaluation process, again, going back to the previous comments, the more resources you put into that, the less resources you've got to spend on other things. And what we're talking about here is public procurement spend. We want as much of that money to go to communities, to go to those small businesses, and to allow them to benefit those communities and employ as many people as possible. So the more resources you put into the bureaucracy, then the less money we've got to put into those other aspects. I think we've got that balance right. I think we monitor and track what's important. We're always looking for opportunities to be able to make to do that more in a cost-effective way. But as I say, I think that balance is important to strike, and I think we've got it right.
Minister, I noted the percentages you were quoting there about the volume of procurement going to SMEs. The FSB said that while the 2014 procurement return dealt with a lot of the issues or the barriers that prevented SMEs from actually accessing public procurement, they say there's no evidence of a significant increase in spending with SMEs. Now, the percentages you gave, were they percentages of contracts or percentages of value of contracts? Sorry, Minister, you were on mute there.
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, no, that's percentage of value.
Percentage of value?
Yeah.
It seems to be an extraordinary difference between the perceptions of the FSB and their members and the perception of government. Do you have any
depends. Sorry, on you go. Yeah, if you look at that data, clearly when we talk about SMEs, SMEs is a broad category. It includes everything up to businesses employing 250 people. And if you break that down, typically you break that down into medium-sized businesses, 50 to 250 people. Small businesses, which is less than 50 people, and if you look at the small business cohort, less than 50 people, they represent about 27% of turnover and benefit from about 26% of the value of public sector spend on procurement. So that is where you would expect it. There is a difference that the FSB identifies when it comes to micro business, which is employing less than 10 people, and they represent about 14% of business turnover and get, if you look at the overall context, about 7% of procurement spend, and in the Scottish context, that's about 10.5% of procurement spend. That's the data in the FSB report. So if you focus specifically on micro businesses, you can see that there is a gap, but I think in reality, if you think about micro businesses, the vast majority of micro businesses are almost all exclusively in the B2C space rather than the B2B space. So they're business to consumer rather than business to business. So those businesses, frankly, are not going to be in a position where they would necessarily want to be accessing larger contracts, because that's not their business model and what they're set up to be. But having said that, I think we're very comfortable about having a conversation with FSB and others, specifically on micro businesses, if they think there's more that can be done there. But as I say, I would be careful about assuming that those statistics for micro businesses mean that there is a problem there. As I say, the vast majority of micro businesses, clearly, if you think about it, that employ 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, are not necessarily in a position where they would want or are able to bid for substantial public sector contracts.
Thank you. What's the Scottish Government's assessment of the remaining barriers which hold back SME participation? Is there anything still significantly out there that is a concern?
It's continued to work on understanding where those challenges are. So I think the supplier development programme has been very effective, because it engages with those businesses. It provides clarity for them as to how to access those contracts. It provides training and support for that. The online portals, I think, are actually, I looked in last night myself just to see what it looked like, and I think that looks fairly user friendly in terms of being able to access what's there. But we can always do more to develop and support that, and communicating through public procurement bodies and others to make that information as widely available as possible is something that I think is important. I think, to be fair, there will be issues, and I've experienced this in my own constituency around about framework agreements. And again, this comes back to the point earlier where an overarching agreement can go to a primary contractor, and then it's about making sure that they are dealing the way we want them to deal with further down the supply chain. So I think that is an aspect that we would probably want to do more work on. The procurement team organises roundtables with SMEs to hear firsthand from them. I took part in one of those sessions a couple of weeks ago, and it was great to hear from small businesses their experience. And of course there are challenges of, as I said, every small business wants to do the best for their business, wants to get as much business as they can from whatever mechanism, so they're always looking for more opportunities, and absolutely that's what they should do. So it's good to hear from those businesses where they see specific challenges, and there are things we need to continue to push on. But I think there's the numbers talk to good progress, but as I say, we continue to look to make those processes as accessible as possible going forward.
Now, there's a couple of barriers that the FSB have highlighted, and they believe there are disproportionate requirements for public liability and professional indemnity insurance, which are not always able to reflect the size of the contracted work. Do you believe that these are real barriers, and have you got any guidance for contracting authorities as to how these requirements can be more proportionate so they don't discourage smaller bidders?
Yeah, I can. I'll maybe bring in Nick Ford to talk to the specifics on those policies, because clearly there's some technicalities around about that. But in principle, of course, it's about getting the balance between having that indemnity and that coverage in place if you're going to undertake that work, because if that's not in place, then clearly we've got opening up all kinds of other potential problems that could occur. So I think it's important that, and from a public servant point of view, from a custodian of public funds point of view, from a custodian of public services point of view, we wouldn't want to put ourselves in a place where the indemnity wasn't there and we weren't able to ensure things were done properly and in the correct and thorough manner. So I think it's getting the balance between that and then how much we can loosen up those restrictions, allow SMEs to be able to take part in that process. But I'll let Nick kind of come in and comment on the technical aspects of that.
Do we have Nick Ford? I see him on my screen, but I cannot hear him.
I am here. Apologies, I'm having terrible network problems this morning. I'm not sure if you can.
Do you want to try and perhaps comment on that, subject to IT, of course, supporting you in that?
On the professional indemnity, obviously we recommend that it's proportionate and public bodies should consider what's for the size and scale of the programme that's been undertaken, showing that there's no unnecessary barriers. In the Scottish Government model terms and conditions,
Nick Ford, I'm afraid I'm not making that out. I don't know if other committee members are, but I think unfortunately your connection is not working for us. So unfortunately we'll just have to move back to, I think, Susan Craig, who is with us as well. I think her internet connection may be working a bit better. Would you like to perhaps come back on that question, Susan?
Yes, of course. Apologies for our connection issues. Yes, you can just repeat some in case you didn't hear all of what Nick was saying. Professional indemnity insurance is what we call selection criteria, and that's criteria set governed by the legislation, which is to determine the suitability of bidders to actually bid. Now, the legislation makes it quite clear that these should be set at a level that is relevant to the contract and proportionate to the market looking to bid. So it's for public bodies to determine on a case-by-case basis what would be relevant for the needs of the contract. But in addition to that, we in Scottish Government publicise our model terms and conditions that we use for contract award. And we're undertaking a piece of work at the minute to look at how we could check the suitability of these, check the risk assessment attached to them, and that includes looking at things like indemnities and insurance, just to be sure that they're proportionate. And if need be, look to see if we could find a simple set of terms and conditions that could be shared to try and address some of these issues around barriers.
Is this an issue?
Colin Beattie, back to you.
Yeah, is this an issue that you're actively looking at? I mean, clearly the FSB believe this is an issue, and that it's not always proportionate. Is the government aware of this? Are they alert to this? Are they actually looking actively about this question of proportionality?
Proportionality.
Susan,
if the Minister could come back in and...
Yeah, no, absolutely. To answer the question, yes, we are. As I said, it's about getting that balance right to, and as was said by Nick and Susan, it's the proportionality effect of that is important. That's what we recommend. And yes, we are looking to see what further steps can be done. But as I said, it's important to get that balance right between the protections that are in place and making sure those are what's necessary, the cover that's necessary is in place, because to not have that clearly opens up all kinds of other issues, but understanding what and addressing any opportunities that we can to be able to lessen those requirements where it makes sense to do so. So yes, we are looking at that.
Thank you, Minister. Back to you, Convener.
Yes, thank you. We now come to questions from the Deputy Convener, Willie Coffey. So, Deputy Convener, over to you.
Thanks, Gordon. Good morning, Minister. Could I take you back to the conversation a moment ago about the frameworks, some of the bigger frameworks? For a number of years, small companies in my constituency said to me that they could never get near any of these. The bigger frameworks were designed, they felt, for the big boys, and they lived off the scraps on the table and so on. The 58% by value to SMEs you mentioned earlier, the SMEs aren't getting 58% of the bigger framework contracts, are they?
That is across all spend, yeah.
Right, so the big, for example, Scottish Water tend to bundle everything up into big frameworks, and it's bigger players that tend to get these rather than the small SMEs. That's what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I can't talk Scottish Water. Yeah, can't Scottish Water particularly, but one of the things that we're making more and more use of is lotting. So breaking down those larger contracts into smaller lots, make it easier for smaller businesses to be able to access those. There's also a balance, of course, in terms of making sure there's a capability and capacity in SMEs as well, because depending on the nature of the contract, if it's very, very technical, it requires a high degree of expertise or access to technology or whatever, then there's going to be obviously limitations there, and it's about getting that balance right as well.
That was one of the issues that they mentioned along for a number of years, Minister. On the one hand, they agree that visibility has improved and quick quotes and all that's there, but the process of bidding still tended to favour those with the resources to throw at it. I wonder if you still felt that that's still the same or improving, or can we do a little bit more to continue to improve that?
I think we continue to look at that, and it's good to hear that feedback. Absolutely, there's obviously the purchasing, the public sector purchasing authorities lay out their strategy, what their forward view looks like, to give them as much visibility of what's coming down the pipeline as possible, so that all businesses, but SMEs in particular, have got access to be able to see what's happening there. But I think, going back to the point earlier, there's that balance between the more requirements you put in around about monitoring of what businesses are doing. Proportionately, that's harder on smaller businesses. So the very, very worthwhile monitoring we put round about Fair Work First and other aspects of that, community wealth building and so on and so forth, the more you're asking for public sector bodies and businesses to track those issues, then obviously that makes the process more complicated. And there's also requirements that, as you would imagine, it's this balance between us making sure money is spent in the right place, the right purpose, in the most effective way, but also working as hard as we can to make sure smaller businesses are getting the opportunities there. So that's important. We continue to look at that balance to see what changes we can make, and that's an ongoing process.
Some of the background that we have for the meeting, Minister, I'm reading that authorities like Clackmannan, Fife and Glasgow were asking for an increase in these regulated thresholds, which would let SMEs use quick quotes for more opportunities. I'm not quite sure why the threshold would stop them using that. Is that something you're familiar with? Could you tell us a wee bit more about that?
Made changes there, and I don't have the precise numbers, but I'm sure Susan or Nick will come in and give the precise numbers. But we have made changes there already, and it's something we're looking at to see what more can be done. Susan, is that something you want to comment on?
Yes, I'm happy to add to that. So the Procurement Reform Act actually increased the advertising ability. So that was increasing the accessibility to opportunities to businesses, including SMEs, to a lower value threshold. And that the figures attached to that are for goods and services. It's any contract above £50,000. And for works contracts, it's anything over £2 million. So these, previous to the Act, weren't opportunities that would be advertised. So the issue around threshold has to be balanced with opportunity to access far more contracts, to applying some rigour to the process and scrutiny and due diligence to being awarded a contract.
And one of those giving us evidence for the meeting, Minister Ben Scott, they were asking if we could increase the use and the weighting of community benefit clauses, and I think there's a figure there that says it's been stuck at £4 million since 2014. Could you tell us a wee bit more about that? Is that something that we could introduce a little bit more flexibility into?
Sorry, I think maybe I'm wrong, and Susan might be right, but I think that the £4 million is a number that was reduced. Is that right, Susan? Is that the number that was reduced to £2 million?
So you're thinking about the project bank accounts threshold that was reduced?
Yeah, is that
so just set in the Act at £4 million?
Right. Okay. So yeah. So if the ask is that something we can change, and that's something we can look at, if that's seen as being a specific barrier. But that's a project bank accounts. That's the mechanism that allows us to pay through those bank accounts to Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers to make sure they're getting the prompt payment benefits. But if that's the ask, we obviously continue to monitor and look and see what opportunities there are be able to make changes to those limits.
Good. Last query from me. Minister, again, it was back to a local experience a number of years ago, that a local company, 100 years experience doing wonderful work in one of the particular sectors, electrical sectors and so on, then suddenly being faced with demands about, the process and the difficulty of throwing resources at that, the requirement to have internationally recognised quality management standards, all suddenly kind of emerging in the kind of modern era, right, which their initial reaction to was, for goodness sake, what have we been doing for 100 years if it hasn't been any good? Is there still a sense there that we're asking smaller companies that perhaps don't have the resource to embed themselves and embrace many of the changing standards, and thereby they therefore miss out on opportunities in the future when they're quite clearly capable of delivering, and their track record shows that?
Yeah, I mean, also electrical standards now aren't what they were 100 years ago. You aren't quite old enough to remember that, but we certainly remember them from 30 or more years ago, and the world has, of course, moved on. And electrical standards is clearly an area where you would want to get it right. For obvious reasons, and I think having internationally recognised quality standards is probably a good thing, certainly in my experience of working in business. So I think, again, it comes back to this making sure we've got the standards to protect the quality of work that's done, that the public is going to be face to face with, be that in schools, hospitals, or whatever. It's really important, as you know, to get that quality of work absolutely right, and I think we definitely can't compromise on that. So having those standards and requirements in place is really, really important. On the flip side of that, though, the work through the supplier development programme is about making sure that we're able to develop suppliers so that they're able to increase their capability and be able to be at a standard where they are able to access and bid for that work. Those criteria need to be proportionate, so depending on the nature of the contract will dictate the type of requirements that we put in place. And we've also now got this single point of inquiry, so allows suppliers to be able to go there, put in their query, raise their concerns, and get responses that hopefully help them either to understand better what the requirements are and why they're there, or to help them to access support to improve their increase their capability and the qualifications that they hold.
It wasn't about their unwillingness to embrace the standards, it was about the additional cost and burden for a smaller enterprise to move into this kind of territory compared to the bigger boys who can throw money at it pretty easily. It's really about that imbalance rather than their unwillingness to embrace the standards itself.
I'm sure that they're very willing to embrace the standards, and as I say, the supply chain development programme and the training and support that goes with that is to help them embrace those standards and as helpful as possible. But of course, also, I mean, depending on the contracts they're going for in the private sector, I would be those standards are going to be something that's going to help them to access bigger contracts in the private sector as well, I'm sure. So I think it's a win-win for everybody.
Good. Many thanks. Back to you, Convener.
Thank you. Now, Graham Simpson.
Yeah, thanks, Convener, and good morning, Minister. It's good to see you. Now, you, before you became an MSP, had a successful career in business, which is quite unusual. I think you may well be, well, you're certainly one of the few ministers who has that background, but very useful in your job. I'm just wondering if you have any personal experience of using the procurement system and what you found.
Yeah, well, the micro business I ran was all business to business, and it was all in the private sector. So I didn't engage through my consultancy business, but through manufacturing businesses that I've been part of the leadership of and had interests in. There have been occasions where, and this is obviously going back a number of years now, we're talking for these criteria were put in place before the the Act was put in place and the latest processes that are there. And I have to tell you, we're going back 10 years or so, manufacturing businesses I had an interest in trying to access public sector opportunities was problematic. So I think it's good to see that the progress that has been made now, looking at it from the other side of the fence, and many of those challenges have been addressed, I hope.
So you think things have improved from the time when you were in business?
I would say so, certainly from talking to businesses at the round tables that I've been involved in, from looking at the process that's in place now, from looking at the supplier development programme, which is obviously a relatively new initiative that's got many thousands of businesses involved in it, from looking at the online portal and seeing how it's relatively easy to be able to understand and access what's there, the strategies that local authorities put in place now to be able to give visibility to businesses. I think there's been a lot of progress on the back of the Act and other work that's happened over, I would say, the last number of years.
Okay, that's really interesting. Now, I'm just wondering, I'm not asking you to make a political comment on this, but obviously, we've left the EU, and some people, in fact, there's been a number of Scottish councils have said that they think there's the possibility, the opportunity there to strengthen or change procurement regulations now that we're out of the EU. So I know you weren't in favour of us leaving the EU, but do you see the possibility there of strengthening some localisation requirements, for example, which other members have raised already?
There are, to some extent, you got to be careful, because when we talk about we're out of the EU, it doesn't mean there aren't any requirements, and particularly in the area of public sector procurement, because the GPA, the WTO, the World Trade Organization's GPA, that lays down the rules internationally to create a fair playing field for businesses is really important. It's really important we comply with that. So, of course, that means that Scottish businesses are able to go and bid for contracts internationally, which is hugely important for all kinds of reasons I don't need to explain to you. And the quid pro quo for that, of course, is that international businesses are able to bid within Scotland. So when you look at that aspect of it, there are still those WTO GPA regulations in place that we need to comply with. And of course, also the UK has got its TCA agreement with the EU, which addresses many of these issues as well. So when you actually look at the space that's there and the ability to be able to move away from those EU regulations, it's fairly limited in nature. Now, there may be examples where that is the case, and I think those conversations were very comfortable to have and understand what opportunities that there may be there. But of course, bearing in mind that we'd want to say, for lots of good reasons, economic reasons as well, that as closely aligned to the EU requirements as possible where it makes sense to do so. So taking that in the round, there may be examples where things can be slightly different, but I think it's really important to be careful not to get too overboard about the difference that makes in reality.
Yes, I wouldn't want you to go overboard about anything, Mr. McKee, but you do see that there is some wriggle room there, and so is that something that you'll be looking at?
It's something that we, as I said, it's important to understand within the context of what the WTO GPA restrictions are and what the UK's TCA with the EU, what the implications of that are. And I think people can easily overstate the opportunities that this does create.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Now, Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Convener. I refer members to my register of interest. The Scottish Government funded a sustainable procurement training programme which trained 220 procurement professionals before it was cancelled in 2016. Does the Minister plan to reinstate this programme, and has consideration been given to establishing an Academy for Excellence or an accredited qualification?
So you're talking about an accredited qualification for small businesses to supply to the public sector?
Of procurement professionals, so we're enhancing their professional development.
Well, that's ongoing through the Supplier Development Programme and the training that exists as part of that. And as I mentioned, that programme is continuing. We've got a total of 17,500 suppliers working through that programme, and another 1,500 registered in the course of the last year. So there's a huge amount of work happening through that programme to work with SMEs to help them to upskill and to be able to access those requirements. And clearly, in terms of procurement skills, our professional bodies that do that, our focus is on supporting. So I think you're talking about the skills for SMEs to access the public sector contracts. Is that specifically where you're focused?
The focus is actually more on how we can focus the procurement professionals and the NHS, local authorities.
Right, okay. Yeah. No, sorry. So that work continuing as well, and I'll let Susan come in a minute. But there's a number of mechanisms whereby that engagement takes place. I'm engaging with senior procurement professionals across the public sector from a leadership point of view around about these issues. And there's work ongoing to engage with buyers all the way down through those different organisations, through e-learning, etc., to help them to understand more thoroughly the duties that are in the Act. And how they can best take those forward and get the benefits, the benefits of them. And there's a number of targeted capability programmes focused specifically on that, working with public sector buyers to give them that skill set.
So,
Thank you.
Happy to add if that's useful.
Please, Susan.
Yes, happy to add a little bit if that's useful. So, Maurice, you mentioned with regards to sustainable procurement duty training, that's an ongoing focus for us because that's an opportunity to further policies and outcomes through procurement. So we have a national framework available for that kind of training. In addition, we've got a set of tools which have supporting advice and guidance in relation to various outcome areas, including climate, fair work, equalities, etc., to provide advice and guidance and all of that. And on professionalisation, very much a key area for us. And we've got a national procurement development framework, which is looking at effective recruitment and continuous professional development and career paths for procurement professionals. And for the young, we've got a focus on Procurement People of Tomorrow programme, where we look at bringing in new entrants through apprenticeships, etc., into the area.
Thanks for those comments, both. Despite the First Minister declaring a climate emergency in 2020, the Scottish Government have missed a host of environmental targets, from recycling and renewable heat to biodiversity and source emissions. And although a Sustainable Procurement Act was passed in the last Parliament, there's still a lack of progress in this area. And I wonder if the Minister thinks that there's sufficient weighting given to environmental measures and procuring circular economy models rather than more traditional processes.
Well, the last year, I think you'll find we're making very good progress. Clearly, some issues have been postponed due to the COVID pandemic over the last 12 months that we would otherwise have been taken forward more tenuously, and that's of course well recognised. But in terms of the specifics round about climate and circular economy, that's a key part, obviously, of the sustainable procurement duty. If you look at the whole picture, in terms of the balance of selection criteria. That ranges from a 60-40 split, which is 60 in favour of quality and the various aspects that are included within that, versus 40 on price, up to 70% or more on quality and 30% or less on price. So that the balance is very much on the non-price aspects, if you like, and climate and renewables as part of that. And clearly you've got 100% to play with. So the more you give to climate and circular economy, the less you're giving to other aspects that we'd want to consider as being hugely important as well. But there are some great examples where we've made some tremendous progress in terms of procurement, because that climate imperative is part of the duty. It's something that local bodies, as you'll see from the reports, purchasing authorities include in their annual reports. It's something that drives the decision-making process for those for the procurement decisions that they make, and it's something that we continue to focus on with them because of recognition of the importance of it.
Thank you, Minister. Just a quick follow-up on that, and happy for you to write to the committee. In terms of price and quality, which you mentioned, that wouldn't affect the change in behaviour from public sector procurers to focus on circular economy business models, for example, renting and leasing and service models for things like lighting, rather than the capital spend to purchase outright lighting, for example. And is there a change, or are you seeing a change in that space, of moving traditional procurement models across to circular economy procurement?
Yeah, and if you look at the infrastructure plan that Michael Matheson produced, just published just recently, the criteria, the focus there is all about the last thing you do is build something new. The first thing you do is look to reuse what you've got, repurpose what you've got, adapt it to what you need it to be going forward. So I think really from the very top of the infrastructure spend, which is obviously where much of this will be impacted, there's a real recognition and a very strong direction that's what needs to be done, and clearly that percolates down to the individual procurement decisions that are making each part of those projects.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Convener.
All right, Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Just to continue the earlier discussion with Willie Coffey on SME access to large frameworks, there's no doubt there's been progress in awarding more contracts to SMEs, but how do you combat the often mistaken belief that many public bodies hold that larger contracts are better value for money, cheaper to manage and easier to get one large contract approved?
Again, you've always got to get this balance, because you need to be able to manage those contracts in a way that's going to get the right value for the public purse, and also be able to control them from a quality and an implementation point of view. So there is a balance that needs to be struck there, but I think the steer is very much to make those contracts as small and as manageable as possible. And I think the lotting process, whereby we break up those larger contracts into smaller lots, make it more accessible for SMEs, is an important part of that. And I think big progress has been made there, and it's something we continue to look at to see what further opportunities can be done. And I think that allows us to get that balance between having the contracts as small as possible to allow SMEs to access them without making it unmanageable and cost prohibitive from having to do that way.
And just on that point of breaking down larger contracts, in the procurement annual report, it states we consider splitting up larger value contracts and frameworks into specialist or geographical requirements. Can you say how many frameworks were awarded to SMEs on that basis?
I don't have that data. It will be somewhere. We'll either get back to you on that, or I'll ask if Susan or Nick have any numbers on that, or even any examples of it might be helpful.
Okay, thanks.
So I can give some figures with regards to what you've described there as specialist or regional lotting of higher value contracts. The figures are 22.5% of those contracts were actually allotted. We don't have figures about how many SMEs, just because our data systems don't collect that particular level of detail, have been engaged then in the various lotting of contracts, but it's really quite a significant number that 22.5% were allotted to provide the opportunity for smaller businesses to engage in these large frameworks.
And just my final point on this. Sorry, I'm getting feedback here. On my final point on large contracts, are there any changes, Minister, that you would like to see to the procurement process as we move forward?
I think we continue to move forward with the things we've got in train. There's right across the whole range, so that's understanding the importance of small businesses, looking for opportunities to build capacity in Scottish businesses, and making sure that we're rolling out those continuing to push the prompt payment aspects further down the supply chain, and so on and so forth. I think on the supply side of it is possibly something where we've done a lot of focus clearly on the demand side, making sure procurement professionals do what they need to do. And we've done a lot of work on the supply side around about supplier development programmes, but there's possibly more we can do there to make sure strategically understanding which Scottish suppliers we need to work with to get them in a place over a period of time where they've got the capability, the capacity, the skills, the technical knowledge to be able to access bigger contracts. I think we can possibly be more strategic about that and understanding who those suppliers are and how we get them to that place.
And just my final question, I wanted to ask a question about competitive tendering. We've had several respondents suggest that competitive tendering model is ill suited for the social care sector, and the procurement process puts downward pressure on employees' pay and terms, and is causing recruiters issues with losing staff to other sectors who offer better terms. Has the Scottish Government evaluated the effect of pausing competitive tendering during the pandemic, and have you given any consideration to any long-term changes?
Things in there. Clearly, this is all in the context of the National Care Service work which is going to take forward. And of course, that's going to come forward as proposals which will include procurement as part of that. So procurement's not obviously going to run off on its own and start making changes piecemeal outside the context of that National Care Service. So I think that's the important overarching piece of it. I mean, at the moment, local authorities, they're not able to, they've got to consider the full range of aspects, including quality, as well as price, which is something that we've got that the rest of the UK doesn't have. In the rest of the UK, you can make those decisions purely on price. Scotland, you're not allowed to do that. You need to consider the full range of aspects as part of your consideration. And local authorities already got the ability to be able to do and make those decisions through processes other than tendering. So they've already got the capability to do that themselves, or do it through partnership, or through some other route that isn't an open tender. So those are already in place. I think it's easy to say pause the process for now, but clearly that's got a lot of implications, and in actual fact could make things more complicated, not less, given where things are at the moment. So I think the correct approach is to get the National Care Service model worked up and articulated, and clearly procurement is a key part of that. Those proposals will come forward and be implemented when that happens, and that'll address these issues. But certainly the procurement professionals in the public sector are very aware of the issues and how they can work as part of an overall process to do exactly what it is you're articulating, which is have a process that's focused on fair work at its core, providing that high quality service, and doing so in a way that values the workforce within the sector.
All right, I think there are no further questions from committee members, and in that case, Thank you very much to the Minister and Susan Craig for joining us today. We'll now, I will bring this session to a close and suspend the meeting and move to private session, which will start at 10:45. Thank you.
Thank you.